Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talk Tech with Data Dave. I am Alexis, not Data Dave, obviously, and I'm here with Data Dave to talk about a cloud question. Talk Tech with Data Dave is brought to you by D3 Clarity, offering clarity for improved decision making. D3 Clarity delivers profitability multipliers through better data and digital infrastructure. For more information, contact D3 Clarity at d3clarity.com. I'm super excited. How are you this morning? Well,
I'm
it's
very
not
well. How are
morning
you?
anymore, is it?
It's not warning, but we'll go with
I'm just messing up
it.
this intro completely. Before we get started, Dave, I always like to start these episodes by reminding our listeners that you can always submit a question to Data Dave by emailing us at talktech d3clarity.com. You can also submit a question right on our website or connect with either one of us on LinkedIn. We would love to chat with you more. So, Dave, that cloud question that I messed up in our intro, let me talk a little bit about it. Here's the question. How can businesses tackle compliance in the cloud? Now, we're taking a weird path here. As you and I both have talked about previously, and even in previous podcasts, um, those two things might not always go hand in hand the way this question is implying. So let's try to answer it anyway. How can businesses tackle compliance in the cloud?
So that is an interesting question. It's an interesting way that it's worded. So I'm going to separate it for a moment and then we'll try and pull it together. How's that?
I like that idea.
So I'm going to separate the idea of compliance and the idea of the cloud and then try and bring together what compliance and cloud might mean together. So compliance to me is compliance to policy and process, right?
Mhm.
How do you comply with a documented policy or a documented procedure that is published, whether it comes from regulatory or from internal, you're still complying with something. So from an export compliance perspective, there's that kind of compliance. There's the Sarbanes or SOX compliance that we're all familiar with. You're very familiar with SOX 2 and so on. So from a compliance point of view, it's about making sure your procedures and policies are documented and that you are appropriately policing those procedures and policies to ensure that you comply with them, that you are
Mhm.
following them. Now, there are various aspects to that, right? Which is we can talk about finance policies and procedures. We can talk about regulatory ones, right? Like we can talk about security ones. We can talk about physical access ones. We can talk about there's various laptop management ones. The cloud doesn't necessarily apply to all of these procedures and policies to which you're complying. We're
Yeah,
using that word an
so
awful.
so one of the SOC 2 compliance regulations, one of the SOC 2 controls is actually that we are required to do annual performance evaluations on our employees every year. That has
Yes.
nothing to do with whether or not we're in the cloud. But it is part of the SOC 2 controls. So to your point, those two things definitely there don't really
Right.
match or matter.
Now, do we use the cloud to do that? Yes, we do. We store all our performance reviews in OneDrive and wherever else. So they're stored in the cloud and they're secure and whatever else around the cloud. So we do use the cloud technologies, but the cloud does not really impact that side of compliance,
No, that
right?
policy would
Nor
be the
does it
same
affect,
if we were on the cloud or on-prem.
right, exactly. Now, it does to a certain extent, we do use the cloud to affect compliance quite significantly, right? Because as you well know, we've got data access policies within D3 Clarity, and we've got laptop control policies and things like that. Well, as one of the people who does work with a lot of our secure data and proprietary data, right? I do all that in the cloud. I actually
Mhm.
build myself cloud-based desktops and remote desktop into them to avoid having any data on my laptop at any time. So my laptop becomes just a window into the cloud because it is easier to then comply with not having any data in my laptop. And if my laptop did get stolen, yes, my laptop's encrypted. You know that because you police that,
Yep.
right? But so my laptop is encrypted, but all my data, I actually have almost a virtual machine per client in the cloud that I then log into specifically to keep them separated, isolated, secured, etc. and work that way quite frequently. So the cloud does help in that regard, but it's not really the cloud that's the policy is that we've got strict controls over allowing data onto our own laptops because it is often sensitive information. So we don't do that. We've got a policy that says you shouldn't do that. Therefore, we don't. And one of the ways I comply with that is by using the cloud, and I advise other people in the organization to do the same thing when we're not logging onto our clients' site and equipment. So we do that. So the cloud, to a certain extent, does make it easier to comply in that way, using that technology applied to the policy and procedure that we have to comply with,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the way I look at it is I separate the cloud as a technology platform from the compliance being a policing policy and procedure type structure. Does that make sense?
For sure.
You still want people to want to comply with the policies, right? It shouldn't all be about policing. The fact that we require HIPAA training, the fact that we require security training, etc., once a year, that's a policy and a procedure. It may or may not be delivered in the cloud,
Right.
right? Now the cloud does help, as I've said, and the cloud definitely, well, if you look at, this, the SOX stuff, it has physical access requirements and things like that, where everything has to be locked and
Yeah.
things like that. To a certain extent, the cloud does help there because you get it from, I don't own any hardware really. It's owned by somebody else and I rent it. So it's up to them to make it secure.
Yeah, and we're in kind
Um,
of an interesting boat there because we're a remote organization. When when
yes.
I when I was going through all of our policies for the annual policy review this year, our Remetic team member was like, "Hey, noticed you have a lot of stuff not in your physical access policy. That seems kind of weird." And I was like, "Oh, but we don't have an office. Like we're a
You don't
remote
have an office.
organization. So we have a physical access policy that says, yes, we need to lock our computers whenever we walk away from them. And we have a physical access policy that says, don't leave your computer sitting in public. But we don't have one that says, make sure that the on-premise server is locked or make sure that the office is locked whenever you leave because we're in the cloud. I mean, we're consistently in
We
the
don't,
cloud.
yeah, we don't have any, right? We don't
Right.
have any data centers. We are exclusively in the cloud. From our operation system. So, and even our laptop policies are pretty benign because, like I said, we use laptops as a window, as a glass
Right.
into the cloud and let the cloud lock it all up,
So
right?
for us, we are able to it's very inherently blended or it makes a little bit more sense for us because we're a remote organization, but even non-remote organizations still work in the cloud.
Yes, but often the policies and procedures aren't written necessarily with cloud in mind. They're written with the data or the behavior in mind, and the cloud may or may not make it easier. And if you are an on-premise organization or you've got your policies that have grown up on-premise, then moving to the cloud can affect those procedures and policies, right? And so that's an interesting way to look at it as well, because when we were at IBM, we did have all the procedures and policies. We owned the whole shooting match, right? And when we're at other organizations where we did require physical access and various things. The other thing that is interesting is that the paradigm of least privilege that is prevalent in the cloud and never was on premise does make it easier to police things,
Hmm.
right? Because you have to now, when you're working in the cloud, you have to explicitly turn on access
Right.
to a particular application. So if we put an application in the cloud, we have to explicitly grant access to people rather than it being you have access and people get turned off. So that actually makes it easier because fewer things are just natively available until
Okay.
you explicitly want.
You just said something
And
that sparked something in my brain. I I'm our M365 admin. You know that, Dave, but maybe our listeners don't know that. And the other day, Patrick asked me to assign a couple of people to a specific cloud application within our Active Directory. to give us access to a specific part of AWS. That
Yes.
that is the principle of least privilege at what you're explaining
Yes.
at its core, right? It's saying
Right.
you guys can't access it right now until I give you access to it, and then when I give you access,
Until
you can get there.
That's right, exactly. And because you've granted access, you can audit that access, right? Because
Yes.
it's written down that you granted the right. It's in the audit trail, it's in the you
Hmm.
explicitly granted access. The cloud natively, now people don't always set it up this way, but the cloud natively has the idea of least privilege. You can do nothing until you grant it. Now we find places where that's violated and so on all the time, as you've heard the horror stories of it. But you have to explicitly grant access. So sometimes people do explicitly grant access to everybody.
Hmm.
That's a foul. You shouldn't do that, right? That's a non-compliant policy. Certainly with it for us. So by you being asked to explicitly grant access within AWS to those people for that application is exactly that, which now there's an audit trail that says Patrick asked for it and the admin granted it
Hmm.
on this date for these people. And if those people leave, it will get automatically
Removed.
terminated.
Yep.
That's exactly what that means. So it makes it easier that, but what we're really saying there is the principle of least privilege affects the policing of policy, right? The principle of least privilege is often inherent within the cloud. The cloud doesn't necessarily give you that,
Hmm.
but it is a tool that you can absolutely use to help with compliance and help with getting visibility and auditability and compliance to policy and procedure.
Yes.
Does that make
Okay.
sense?
I love when things like that come up, click in my brain when we're talking. It 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 maybe isn't helpful for any of our listeners, but for me, things like when things like that click into place, I'm like, oh my gosh, I understand stuff a little bit more now. So that was
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you for letting me go on that tangent.
The other example that I would use for that, which is one we discussed earlier, is the our friend from Remedic,
Mhm.
who was mentioning penetration testing and the fact that when he was doing penetration testing on premise, he would get hundreds of violations and hundreds of vulnerabilities that all had to be remediated. But when he does penetration testing against cloud-based applications, he gets far, far, far fewer,
Mhm.
right? And that is again this idea of least privilege, which is only the ports that are necessary for this to run have been opened in the cloud, because the default in the cloud is to close everything and only open what you need,
Right.
versus the default on premise is everything is open and you close what you can't have, right? And that's a fundamental shift. But it's you can build an on-premise system with a point of view of least privilege, right?
Mhm.
And I'm not sure like I say, I want to separate those. I'm not sure whether that quite answers the question, which is, I can't remember the question now.
Yeah. So how can businesses tackle compliance in the cloud? I'll take it a step further and I'll ask it to you a little bit of a different way, Dave. Um, let's say I'm a business, we'll call it, I don't know, AOK Enterprises. And AOK Enterprises runs on-prem, but I've decided I want to move to the cloud. But I need to still maintain my compliance with my policies, my compliance with my SOC 2 policies, with my ISO 27001, whatever policies. How is moving to the cloud going to impact my compliance as it sits and when I get to the cloud?
It will impact it somewhat in the manner that you comply, because you still have the same policies and procedures. So part of moving to the cloud, you would have to ensure that the procedures and policies that are relevant for that application are still complied with within that cloud movement, right? So therefore, the principle of least privilege might well apply in making sure that only the right people have access to that and it is appropriately locked down. The the risk of failure is greater, because if it is in the cloud, you might accidentally open it up to the entire world, not just your employee base. So you do want to make sure you comply with the policy that you have, which is this audience should have access to it, right?
Hmm.
You might also need to make sure you comply with backup policies, retention policies, and various other things that are built into your on-premise pieces. Now, the nice thing is that the cloud often has these pieces built into it as well. So if you want a 7-year retention policy or a backup policy or a failover policy, a high availability policy, etc., for these systems as part of your process and structure, the cloud has that ability to do that and that ability to play in that space. And often some of this is something you don't have to invent. You can just inherit from AWS or Azure or Google or wherever you go, right, as a cloud provider. So some of them have that built in, but you still need to make sure that your application is compliant with your policies and procedures, and you've got the right audit trail that is contiguous across your on-premise behaviors and your on cloud and in cloud behaviors. And that is on you. That
Hmm.
you can't offload that to the cloud provider, right? Now, there are some things that you do offload to the cloud provider. We just talked about the idea that we as a company don't own, I think, any servers,
Hmm.
right? And yet we're a data company. We don't own any servers because everything is cloud. We're a
Right.
virtual organization. Everything is cloud. While we have to comply with the physical security policies as written in the SOC 2 documents, and we have to validate that we're doing that, one of the ways we validate that we're doing that is that we simply read the AWS and Azure, Microsoft Azure service levels, and they say, oh, we guarantee that every server is behind a locked door and it's got power and it's in a safe bomb-proof environment and whatever else, right? So we just say, oh, well, yeah, they're contractually committed to supply that to us, so yes, we've got it, right?
Yeah,
So
and
we
I mean,
don't
a
have to
step
go
further,
in.
we sometimes just pull their SOC 2s and we attach it to
Exactly.
ours. I mean,
Yeah,
I just made a
exactly.
stapler. There's no stapling. We don't have any papers, but yeah, that's what we do.
Exactly. We just attach it and
Yeah.
have a nice life, right? So yeah. So there's an element where the use of that technology can make it easier to comply, but the policies and procedures are still yours. You made a key point, which is you pull theirs and you attach them to ours.
Hmm.
We still have to comply with the policies and procedures of SOC 2 that we are following, and we use theirs to help demonstrate that because we use their services, we are compliant and we've got a pass through to where our servers
Hmm.
live. Now, if we configure those cloud servers to not be secure, or we don't have the backups built or the various things built in the cloud, it's us that's non-compliant, not the cloud provider,
Hmm.
right? Because they've got the ability to provide that. We have to take responsibility to make sure we use it in order to be compliant.
So, I'm gonna ask the last question I asked you one more time, and let's make sure that we've got a kind of a solid answer here. If I was an on-prem organization and I'm deciding I'm going to move to the cloud, how is that going to impact my compliance? From what you just said, um, it 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 won't impact your policies. It might impact how you implement those policies. Does that sound about right?
That's exactly what I would probably say. You might decide that you can change those policies, but you need to look at the policies and procedures that you are complying to, and make sure that you are completely covered in a manner that is appropriate for where you're placing that application, that data,
Hmm.
right? So it might impact how you do it, but it doesn't impact your responsibility to do it,
There we go. That's a good place.
right? And that I think is the crucial piece.
Yes. Very good. So I hope we answered that question the way it was posed to us. I think we did. I think we got to the heart of it. If you're out there and you're like, Alexis, Dave, you missed the mark here. I need you to try again. Reach out to us. Give us a little bit more
Yeah, more than
context.
happy to
We'll
try
try
again.
again.
Yeah, we'll try again. We're not against trying again, not against somebody adding more color to it.
Yeah.
Um, because this is our thinking, and the question, like I say, I'm not sure we completely answered it because I'm not sure I understand how it was worded.
Mhm. I think that's okay though. I I'm I learned in this conversation, and that's really what I care about, which is awful because this podcast is supposed to not be for me, but it really is. Like, let's be honest. Everyone
Yes,
out
it is.
there, please send us your questions. You can reach out to us at talktech@d3clarity.com or right on the D3 Clarity website. We would be happy to answer your questions on the podcast. Dave, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope everyone has a fantastic day.
Yes, thank you, everybody, and thank you, Alexis.
If you have a question for Data Dave, reach out to us via email at talktech@d3clarity.com. We'll be happy to answer your questions in the podcast. Thanks. This podcast has been brought to you by D3 Clarity. No one has time or patience to fix all of their data and infrastructure problems. D3 Clarity helps some of the world's most recognizable brands take the right action to turn their information into strategic profit making. For more information, go to D3 Clarity. That's the letter D, the number 3, the word clarity.com.